We start over with our talk from Karl and Carsten about Apache Sling connecting to your content.
All right.
Welcome,
Thanks, Lars.
Carsten and Karl.
All right, yeah. Welcome to our talk. You already know the speakers, I guess, Karl from yesterday and myself from yesterday. But more interesting is the topic we have is basically it's about how to connect content to your Sling application. And as you know, Sling, the basic concept of Sling, which we actually came up with like roughly 11 years ago, is the resource abstraction. So everything that Sling deals with is a resource. And usually that it's mapped to something stored in JCR. If you think of AEM, for example, most of the use cases for Sling are using JCR as well. But you can also store your stuff in a file system, in a Mongo database, or anything else, and that can be represented as a resource in Sling. A resource is just a node in the tree. It has a path to that place in the tree. It has a type, usually the resource type. It has some metadata, like when it was last modified, who modified it, all these things. And it usually has a value map, which is the contents of that resource. The central component in Sling is a resource resolver, and it's basically there for finding resources, getting them, updating them, creating them, doing queries against resources. All these basic operations with resources are basically done through the central service, the resource resolver. So this is just to give you the background. Now, when it comes to content, as I said, usually if you think of the typical use cases where Sling is used, it's stored in JCR. But again, you might have content in your database. You might have content in some, might want to retrieve content from a news feed, might have it in a different remote database and all these things. So how can you get that into your application? If you think about this resource tree that is spawned by all the resources, and it could, for example, look like this one, a basic tree with a root node, some nodes underneath. And in fact, these nodes could be provided by different so-called resource providers. In this example here, we have the JCR resource provider mounted at the root node. So all these yellow nodes are provided by the JCR resource provider. Then on the left, we have a resource provider connecting to a database. So everything that is underneath the Europe tree comes from that provider, and so on with all these other different providers. So that's the basic concept in Sling if you want to connect to additional content. You basically implement a so-called resource provider. If you want to do that, then you have to implement the resource provider interface. It's not really an interface, it's an abstract class, but it's basically more or less the same in that case. If you want to handle authentication against your remote content, then you have to implement that. If you don't need authentication, you don't have to do that. And for the reading case, for the simplest case of getting content into your Sling-based application, you just have to implement two methods. That's basically getting some content and getting the children of content. And we'll see an example in a minute. If you want to support CRUD operations like creating resources, updating, deleting them, then you have to implement 7 additional methods. So it's not really that much work. When it comes to supporting queries and an observation, again, you implement some additional methods, and observation is usually not that difficult. It depends on if you get notification from the remote system or not. But implementing query is a little bit harder and takes some more effort. And just to see that this all works, Karl will continue with some code in a demo.
Right. So yeah, I mean that's just at a minimum, as Carsten said. All we need is to implement 2 methods: get resource and list children for resource, and register that thing as a resource provider. And again, it's a subclass, or it's not an interface, but it gives you additional things that are already implemented. And let me see if I can get out of here. Exactly. So, and we have some example code which I will make available in a little bit here, but let me start the demo server already in the background. So for an example, and we come back with in the second part of the talk again to it, it is connecting to some Dropbox account, and in this case it's mine. And the goal is to make folders and files in a Dropbox account available. In this case, the adaptTo folder, which has a test subfolder and an image of me. It's not as sophisticated as the resource provider we showed in the talk with Radu. That is a real one. This one here is just a little simpler, basically. But to keep it simple, the basic implementation for the Dropbox interface is very simple. It just on startup, it goes out, gets all files and folders from the Dropbox that is configured, and turns them into maps. And have a little abstraction here, which is just the Dropbox provider. For now, the important methods are just get and get children, which return a map and an iterator over maps, just with the plain data from Dropbox, effectively. So just to keep things simple. Again, on init, it will iterate over all the files and then convert them into those maps, and that's it. And for the get, it's just a lookup in a map, and for the get list children or get children, same thing. So having that, we can now wrap that in a simple resource provider. Again, now in a little bit more detail, we can go over it. We make it a SCR component, give it a service interface, even though it's an abstract class, ResourceProvider.class, which we also extend. And we make it configurable, mostly for the only important property in the resource provider case, which is the provider root. We default it to content Dropbox resource, and give it 2 additional properties here, a Dropbox path, which is a path we want to look up in the Dropbox that we configure, and an access token. You could make it more complicated from the Dropbox point of view, but from Sling, that's pretty much all we need. So we create the Dropbox provider in the activate, and then just implement the get resource and the list children method of the resource provider interface from Sling. As Carsten mentioned, the resource provider interface has a couple of more methods that you can implement besides the get resource and list children. And the most important ones are then the CRUD operations like create and delete and so on. But if you don't do that, well, it's just a read-only provider in that case then. Right? So we, for now, just do a read-only one. It's just get resource and list children, which again turns around to the Dropbox provider, gets the hash map or the list of hash maps and converts them. That's the second step you have to do into a resource. So, and for the resource, you create your own resource impl, which I do here. There's an abstract resource around that you can subclass from, which does some of the plumbing already for you. All you have to do then is provide a couple of base methods and implement those, mostly for getting the metadata and the resource type and the actual path of the resource. So once you implemented those from it, that's all you have to do. If we register that service. Let me see here. That should be up by now. Okay, we have a simple sling here, just a normal sling. Let me log in. Great. Okay. Okay, right. So if we go here and just browse the current state of the tree, we will see, well, we have nothing under content except the slingshot and the starter. And if I now go and configure that Dropbox resource provider config that I just showed in the code, right? We take the standard provider route we want to say, so it should go under content Dropbox resource. And we want to go to this adaptTo pass in the Dropbox, so all that's missing is an access token. So let me get one. Oop. Yeah, it's on video, I have to directly nuke it afterwards. So I save that. That should bring up our configured service, right? Because as you could see, we said it has a configuration policy required, so it needs a configuration. Now it has one, and the only one that's not defaulted is the access token, so that's what we just gave it. So from here, we now expect it to be there. And if I now do a refresh, hopefully, yeah, see, the Dropbox resource folder is mounted into the tree. So if we go here, it will now actually list our files and the folder and the subfiles in here, as promised. So with that, let me see if I can get that back to the slideshow. Boop.
Right. And as you could see, Karl is using the default password, so you learned some hours ago how to hack the system, so you can try to get to his machine and hack our Sling installation. Right, so this is basically a very easy way to connect your content to Sling. You just implement this resource provider interface for reading, 2 methods, and you're done. So it's very, very simple. In addition, Sling comes already with various implementations of a resource provider, like a file-based one that reads stuff from a bundle that you deploy into your OSGI framework. We have one for Mongo. I think Cassandra we have as well, and there are maybe a couple of more of them. So this is all nice and straightforward. And actually, I just remembered that, and I guess Stefan is one of those who remembers that as well, that I did a similar talk like 7 years ago at the second adaptTo it was. So why are we doing this again here and then talking about it? So the reason is pretty easy. There's a lot of code for Sling out there that might be very old and then might use or make some assumptions about the system. For example, that resources that you get from the resource resolver are really always backed up by a JCR repository. So they expect that the resource you get back from the resource resolver is actually a JCR resource. Or they try to adapt the resource to a JCR node and then do some stuff. Or use a JCR session with the same path to find the same content as you find in the resource tree. And obviously, if the resources are not backed by a JCR repository, that doesn't work. So you end up with either code not working or usually most cases with null pointer exceptions because people were just assuming that this stuff works. And in addition, search is usually not done through the resource resolver. It's most often using directly the JCR API. So all these cases don't work with the resource provider approach. The general recommendation would be if you're writing new code and don't deal with this old stuff, just use the resource provider and you're happy and all the stuff is pretty simple. But for example, we in AEM land have a lot of little bit older code which makes some of these assumptions, at least in some parts. So if you want to run that code based on a different storage than JCR, you get into trouble. And actually, Karl and myself, we did a prototype like half a year, a little bit more than half a year ago, on how to solve that problem, and we came up with something we called repository mount. So what is that? It's a different variation of the same concept. So if you look at this resource tree here again, all the yellow resources are still served by the JCR resource provider, but underneath that provider, we basically use a JCR mounter, it's called, which is able to delegate the requests for JCR nodes in the end to different repository mounts. One of that is the normal JCR repository, so an oak-based repository, and the other one can be an OSGI service that you implement yourself. So if you're implementing the repository mount service, then you can, for example, delegate some of the JCR requests to that service. Which basically means you're doing the integration of your content on a very low level, right? The Sling resource abstraction is on a higher level, and the JCR repository mount is underneath the JCR API at a very low level. Now, if you want to do that, as I said, you have to implement this repository mount service. Again, if you have to deal with authentication, you implement it, or if you don't, then you don't implement it, obviously. The problematic part here is if you want to implement the repository mount, that class extends the JCR repository class, which is the base class of the JCR API. So in the end, you have to implement the full JCR API, which is huge. It has a lot of classes, and these classes have hundreds of methods, so you have to implement all of them. It's a lot of effort, but it's, as we proved in our prototype, it's possible to do that. And again, query and observation are things you can implement in addition. And Karl will now show how that looks like.
Right. So what we have, and that's just the situation that we are in, right? If you get a resource adapted to a node, well, that node may or may not be there, because if it's not backed by JCR, you cannot adapt it to node, and then if you look it up in a session, you wouldn't get it. So that's the problem that it's trying to solve, at least for certain cases. So it clearly is not a complete solution in the sense that you could solve all JCR related things with it, but if you implement it enough, you get something to work. And I think that was the goal of the prototype. And for now, what we have in Sling is that we added to the JCR base the kind of hooks that we need for doing this, and the implementation is right now up to you completely. So that's a lot of work, or at least substantial work, and so we still need to improve that. But I will make this code available after the talk, so there is at least it's possible. And so the way it works is you register a repository mount. It's in this case an interface, so we have again just a component which is a repository mount. For the example here, we do the same thing. We give it a configuration policy. We want to have a configuration. In this case, it gives the mount points that it wants as a service property. By default, we make it content Dropbox. And then, yeah, like in the other case, we just need the Dropbox path to find the folder in the Dropbox and the access token. So when we get started, and that's using the new R7 style of activate, so it's a constructor activate, but other than that, it's the same thing. We create the Dropbox provider from before, so we piggyback on that as well. And now for the different parts of what you what you get called back as a hook in this case is the login. So when somebody logs in the normal JCR case, right, it will be intercepted by the JCR base, and you get also a login. We can get the parent session, which is the actual session that comes from JCR from the attributes, and then we can create our own session that we return. And for the mount points that we give up here, so in this case content Dropbox, JCR base will then try to bifurcate calls that are for content Dropbox to us, right? So we effectively provide that subtree, while the normal other part just like normally goes to JCR. So the one thing we need on top of the Dropbox provider now is something that creates us node wrappers. So it's somewhat similar to what we had to do for the resource case, where we wrap the maps that we got from the Dropbox provider in a resource. We here now have to implement our own wrapper classes for the JCR hierarchy of node and item and properties. So again, that's a lot of wrappers, and we need to work on the default implementation there. But there is actually something in the half works from Bertrand in the whiteboard, which has some wrapper things there. But yeah, somehow we need to make that easier. Right now, I have copies in here, so you see I have some wrapper classes that I had to create for it myself. But once you have those, well, the interface here becomes reasonably simple. We have a get node, we have get nodes, so that's pretty similar, and we get the maps from the provider here, and the same here for the iterator over the maps for the get nodes, and then for each one we wrap it in a node, in a Dropbox node, and give it the proper JCR, or at least the important JCR properties, when it's a binary, a JCR data, and so on and so forth. Once we have that, we can actually try this out. So I still have the server running. So if I come back here, again, let me close this one. So the Dropbox resource obviously was the one that we mounted via ResourceProvider. If I now go back to our properties, we will see we actually have a similar configuration here, this time for the repository mount. Let me get my token again. Give it the same token, mount the same folder, just under a different path, content Dropbox. Save that. So now it should have published the repository mount as a service, and that will be picked up from now on from the repository base. So if we now reload, yeah, we get a Dropbox folder alongside the Dropbox resource, which has the same content, obviously. Just this time, it actually is backed by JCR nodes, or at least our fake JCR nodes. So actually, if I go here, I see the JCR content, and I can see the JCR data, and I can hopefully click on download. It's downloading something. Yes, it works. So again, there are some limitations even in this implementation now. For example, I didn't implement anything with the query providers, and there's no permission handling. And if you would go, and you could, to implement the CRUD operations on it, well, you would need to make sure you have your own session concept so that you commit or revert correctly. And even if you do that, there's a small gap where obviously we in the end have to commit the whole thing, for example, and then you first commit the JCR, and then you get the commit. So if you fail, you cannot roll back everything correctly because the other thing is gone already. So there are some limitations around the edge cases. But if all you want to do is integrate your content in a way that it is usable by code that assumes that it can adapt to node, or that it can find nodes via a session from you, then it's good enough for doing it this way. That's the new stuff. And here we are again.
Right. So this support for this repository mount is already part of Apache Sling. So when we eventually release this year, Sling 12, it will be included there, so you could use that. For our prototype, we ran. We used a remote storage, which is similar to Dropbox, and we could run more or less most of AEM on top of it without changing any AEM code and going into the code and changing the usage of JCR stuff in there. So that worked pretty well, actually, in the end. As Karl already said, it's a complex approach. It requires a lot of implementation work to implement the whole JCR API, especially as we don't have this default implementation for most of the methods, and you just concentrate on the CRUD operations to implement. It might need some additional work on to support other features apart from the normal CRUD report, CRUD operations. But yes, that's at least it works in our prototype, which is nice. So if you want to connect your content to a Sling application, then look at your use case. Obviously, that's always a good idea to do. And the other thing is look at the code you have, right? If you're not dealing with these cases where wrong assumptions are made, then go for the resource provider, because it's a way simpler way of doing the integration to your content. If you have to deal with old code, then the repository mount is probably a solution to that problem. And yes, obviously, we plan to improve the thing and provide a default implementation so that implementing the repository mount becomes easier. I think there's maybe one remark we could make about performance of these things, because that's maybe people are interested. Is a resource provider more performant than using the repository mount? And I think in the end it doesn't really matter, because more or less the same stuff is happening. If you do a repository mount, maybe some more methods are executed, but that doesn't make a big difference. I think the big problem when it comes to performance is always the connection to your remote database, right? And that's so slow, usually because it's remote, that it doesn't matter if two more methods are executed in the past to get to the content. And with that, we are actually at the end. And we still have 30 minutes, I see. Are there any questions?
Hello, just a very easy question, actually. I saw the resource was visible in the Sling, the browser, the interface. Would implementing the resource provider also cause it to be visible in CRXDE or not?
No, it's not.
Ah, okay.
CRXDE, CRXDE works on the JCR API, so it's not visible.
Yeah,
so
okay.
if you would use the repository mount, then you will see it in CRXDE as well.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Right, that's actually a good example of the difference, right? If you use the resource provider, it will be showing up if something like Composum is only using the resource provider, but not if you use JCR. But yeah, CRXDE shows the repository mount. That's the difference.
Okay, then thank you, Carsten and Karl.
Okay, thank you.